Chapter 14 The South Pole I rushed up onto the platform. Yes, open sea! Barely a few sparse floes, some moving icebergs, a sea stretching into the distance, hosts of birds in the air, and myriads of fish under the waters, which varied from intense blue to olive green, depending on the depth. The thermometer marked a 3° centigrade. It was as if a comparative springtime had been locked up behind that ice bank whose distant masses were outlined on the northern horizon. "Are we at the pole?" I asked the captain, my heart pounding. "I've no idea," he answered me. "At noon we'll fix our position." "But will the sun show through this mist?" I said, staring at the grayish sky. "No matter how faintly it shines, it will be enough for me," the captain replied. To the south, 10 miles from the Nautilus, a solitary islet rose to a height of 200 meters. We proceeded toward it, but cautiously because this sea could have been strewn with reefs. In an hour we had reached the islet. 2 hours later we had completed a full circle around it. It measured 4 to 5 miles in circumference. A narrow channel separated it from a considerable shore, perhaps a continent whose limits we couldn't see. The existence of this shore seemed to bear out Commander Maury's hypotheses. In essence, this ingenious American has noted that between the South Pole and the 60th parallel the sea is covered with floating ice of dimensions much greater than any found in the North Atlantic. From this fact he drew the conclusion that the Antarctic Circle must contain considerable shores, since icebergs can't form on the high seas, but only along coastlines. According to his calculations, this frozen mass enclosing the southernmost pole forms a vast ice cap whose width must reach 4,000 kilometers. Meanwhile, to avoid running aground, the Nautilus halted 3 cable lengths from a strand crowned by superb piles of rocks. The skiff was launched to sea. 2 crewmen carrying instruments, the captain, Conseil, and I were on board. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. I hadn't seen Ned land. No doubt, in the presence of the South Pole, the Canadian hated having to eat his words. A few strokes of the oar brought the skiff to the sand, where it ran aground. Just as Conseil was about to jump ashore, I held him back. "Sir," I told Captain Nemo, "to you belongs the honor of first setting foot on this shore." "Yes, sir," the captain replied. "And if I have no hesitation in treading this polar soil, it's because no human being until now has left a footprint here." So saying, he leaped lightly onto the sand. His heart must have been throbbing with intense excitement. He scaled an overhanging rock that extended in a small promontory, and there, mute and motionless, with crossed arms and blazing eyes, he seemed to be laying claim to these southernmost regions. After spending 5 minutes in this trance, he turned to us. "Whenever you're ready, sir," he called to me. I got out, Conseil at my heels, leaving the 2 men in the skiff. Over an extensive area, the soil consisted of that igneous gravel called tuff, reddish in color, as if made from crushed bricks. The ground was covered with slag, lava flows, and pumice stones. Its volcanic origin was unmistakable. In certain localities, thin smoke holes gave off a sulphurous odor, showing that the inner fires still kept their wide-ranging power. Nevertheless, when I scaled a high escarpment, I could see no volcanoes within a radius of several miles. In these Antarctic districts, as is well known, Sir James Clark Ross had found craters of Mount Erebus and Mount Terror in fully active condition on the 167th meridian at latitude 77 degrees 32 minutes. The vegetation on this desolate continent struck me as quite limited. A few lichens of the species Usnea melanoxanthra sprawled over the black rocks. The whole meager flora of this region consisted of certain microscopic buds, rudimentary diatoms made up of a type of cell positioned between 2 quartz-rich shells, plus long purple and crimson fucus plants, buoyed by small air bladders and washed up on the coast by the surf. The beach was strewn with mollusks, small mussels, limpets, smooth heart-shaped cockles, and especially some sea butterflies with oblong, membrane-filled bodies, whose heads are formed from 2 rounded lobes. I also saw myriads of those northernmost sea butterflies, 3 centimeters long, which a baleen whale can swallow by the thousands in one gulp. The open waters at the shoreline were alive with these delightful pteropods, true butterflies of the sea. Among other zoophytes present in these shallows, there were a few coral tree forms that, according to Sir James Clark Ross, live in these Antarctic seas at depths as great as 1,000 meters. Then small Alcyon coral belonging to the species Procellaria pelagica, also a large number of starfish unique to these climes, plus some feather stars spangling the sand. But it was in the air that life was superabundant. There various species of birds flew and fluttered by the thousands, deafening us with their calls. Crowding the rocks, other fowl watched without fear as we passed and pressed familiarly against our feet. These were auks, as agile and supple in water, where they are sometimes mistaken for fast bonito, as they are clumsy and heavy on land. They uttered outlandish calls and participated in numerous public assemblies that featured much noise but little action. Among other fowl I noted some sheathbills from the wading bird family, the size of pigeons, white in color, the beak short and conical, the eyes framed by red circles. Conseil laid in a supply of them, because when they're properly cooked, these winged creatures make a pleasant dish. In the air there passed sooty albatross with 4-meter wingspans, birds aptly dubbed vultures of the ocean. Also gigantic petrels, including several with arching wings, enthusiastic eaters of seal that are known as quebrantahuesos, and cape pigeons, a sort of small duck, the tops of their bodies black and white. In short, a whole series of petrels, some whitish with white wings, trimmed in brown, others blue and exclusive to these Antarctic seas. The former so oily, I told Conseil, that inhabitants of the Faroe Islands simply fit the birds with a wick, then light it up. With that minor addition, Conseil replied, these fowl would make perfect lamps. After this we should insist that nature equip them with wicks in advance. Half a mile farther on, the ground was completely riddled with penguin nests, egg-laying burrows from which numerous birds emerged. Later, Captain Nemo had hundreds of them hunted because their black flesh is highly edible. They brayed like donkeys. The size of a goose, with slate-colored bodies, white undersides, and lemon-colored neckbands, these animals let themselves be stoned to death without making any effort to get away. Meanwhile, the mists didn't clear, and by 11 o'clock the sun still hadn't made an appearance. Its absence disturbed me. Without it, no sights were possible. Then how could we tell whether we had reached the pole? When I rejoined Captain Nemo, I found him leaning silently against a piece of rock and staring at the sky. He seemed impatient, baffled. But what could we do? This daring and powerful man couldn't control the sun as he did the sea. Noon arrived without the orb of day appearing for a single instant. You couldn't even find its hiding place behind the curtain of mist. And soon this mist began to condense into snow. "Until tomorrow," the captain said simply, and we went back to the Nautilus amid flurries in the air. During our absence the nets had been spread, and I observed with fascination the fish just hauled on board. The Antarctic seas serve as a refuge for an extremely large number of migratory fish that flee from storms in the subpolar zones, in truth only to slide down the gullets of porpoises and seals. I noted some 1 decimeter southern bullhead, a species of whitest cartilaginous fish overrun with bluish-gray stripes and armed with stings. Then some Antarctic rabbitfish 3 feet long, the body very slender, the skin a smooth silver white, the head rounded, the top side furnished with 3 fins, the snout ending in a trunk that curved back toward the mouth. I sampled its flesh, but found it tasteless, despite Conseil's views, which were largely approving. The blizzard lasted until the next day. It was impossible to stay on the platform. From the lounge, where I was writing up the incidents of this excursion to the polar continent, I could hear the calls of petrel and albatross cavorting in the midst of the turmoil. The Nautilus didn't stay idle, and cruising along the coast, it advanced some 10 miles farther south amid the half-light left by the sun as it skimmed the edge of the horizon. The next day, March 20th, it stopped snowing. The cold was a little more brisk. The thermometer marked -2 centigrade. The mist had cleared, and on that day I hoped our noon sights could be accomplished. since Captain Nemo hadn't yet appeared, only Conseil and I were taken ashore by the skiff. The soil's nature was still the same, volcanic. Traces of lava, slag, and basaltic rock were everywhere, but I couldn't find the crater that had vomited them up. There as yonder, myriads of birds enlivened this part of the polar continent. But they had to share their dominion with huge herds of marine mammals that looked at us with gentle eyes. These were seals of various species, some stretched out on the ground, others lying on drifting ice floes, several leaving or re-entering the sea. Having never dealt with man, they didn't run off at our approach, and I counted enough of them thereabouts to provision a couple 100 ships. "Ye gods!" Conseil said. "It's a fortune that Ned Land didn't come with us." "Why so, Conseil?" "Because that madcap hunter would kill every animal here." "Every animal may be overstating it, but in truth I doubt we could keep our Canadian friend from harpooning some of these magnificent cetaceans. Which would be an affront to Captain Nemo, since he hates to slay harmless beasts needlessly." "He's right." "Certainly, Conseil. But tell me, haven't you finished classifying these superb specimens of marine fauna?" "Master is well aware," Conseil replied, "that I'm not seasoned in practical application. When master has told me these animals' names—" "They're seals and walruses." "Two genera," our scholarly Conseil hastened to say, "that belong to the family Pinnipedia, order Carnivora, group Unguiculata, subclass Monodelphia, class Mammalia, branch Vertebrata." "Very nice, Conseil," I replied. "But these two genera of seals and walruses are each divided into species, and if I'm not mistaken, we now have a chance to actually look at them. Let's." It was 8 o'clock in the morning. We had 4 hours to ourselves before the sun could be productively observed. I guided our steps toward a huge bay that made a crescent-shaped incision into the granite cliffs along the beach. There, all about us, I swear that the shores and ice floes were crowded with marine mammals as far as the eye could see, and I involuntarily looked around for old Proteus, that mythological shepherd who guarded King Neptune's immense flocks. To be specific, these were seals. They formed distinct male and female groups, the father watching over his family, the mother suckling her little ones, the stronger youngsters emancipated a few paces away. When these mammals wanted to relocate, they moved in little jumps made by contracting their bodies, clumsily helped by their imperfectly developed flippers, which, as with their manatee relatives, form actual forearms. In the water, their ideal element, I must say, these animals swim wonderfully thanks to their flexible backbones, narrow pelvises, close-cropped hair, and webbed feet. Resting on shore, they assumed extremely graceful positions. Consequently, their gentle features, their sensitive expressions equal to those of the loveliest women, their soft, limpid eyes, their charming poses, led the ancients to glorify them by metamorphosing the males into sea gods and the females into mermaids. I drew Conseil's attention to the considerable growth of the cerebral lobes found in these intelligent cetaceans. No mammal except man has more abundant cerebral matter. Accordingly, seals are quite capable of being educated. They make good pets, and together with certain other naturalists, I think these animals can be properly trained to perform yeoman service as hunting dogs for fishermen. Most of these seals were sleeping on the rocks or the sand. Among those properly termed seals, which have no external ears, unlike sea lions whose ears protrude, I observed several varieties of the species Stenorhynchus, 3 meters long, with white hair, bulldog heads, and armed with 10 teeth in each jaw, 4 incisors in both the upper and lower, plus 2 big canines shaped like the fleur-de-lis. Among them slithered some sea elephants, a type of seal with a short, flexible trunk. These are the giants of the species, with a circumference of 20 feet and a length of 10 meters. They didn't move as we approached. "Are these animals dangerous?" Conseil asked me. "Only if they're attacked," I replied. "But when these giant seals defend their little ones, their fury is dreadful, and it isn't rare for them to smash a fisherman's longboat to bits." "They're within their rights," Conseil answered. "I don't say nay." 2 miles farther on we were stopped by a promontory that screened the bay from southerly winds. It dropped straight down to the sea, and surf foamed against it. From beyond this ridge there came fearsome bellows, such as a herd of cattle might produce. "Gracious!" Conseil put in. "A choir of bulls?" "No," I said. "A choir of walruses." "Are they fighting with each other?" "Either fighting or playing." "With all due respect, master, this we must see." "Then see it we must, Conseil." And there we were, climbing these blackish rocks amid sudden landslides and over stones slippery with ice. More than once I took a tumble at the expense of my backside. Conseil, more cautious or more stable, barely faltered and would help me up, saying, "If master's legs would kindly adopt a wider stance, master will keep his balance." Arriving at the topmost ridge of this promontory, I could see vast white plains covered with walruses. These animals were playing among themselves. They were howling not in anger, but in glee. Walruses resemble seals in the shape of their bodies and the arrangement of their limbs. But their lower jaws lack canines and incisors, and as for their upper canines, they consist of 2 tusks 80 centimeters long, with a circumference of 33 centimeters at the socket. Made of solid ivory, without striations, harder than elephant tusks, and less prone to yellowing, these teeth are in great demand. Accordingly, walruses are the victims of a mindless hunting that soon will destroy them all, since their hunters indiscriminately slaughter pregnant females and youngsters, and over 4,000 individuals are destroyed annually. Passing near these unusual animals, I could examine them at my leisure, since they didn't stir. Their hides were rough and heavy, a tan color leaning toward a reddish brown. Their coats were short and less than abundant. Some were 4 meters long. More tranquil and less fearful than their northern relatives, they posted no sentinels on guard duty at the approaches to their campsite. After examining this community of walruses, I decided to return in my tracks. It was 11 o'clock, and if Captain Nemo found conditions favorable for taking his sights, I wanted to be present at the operation. But I held no hopes that the sun would make an appearance that day. It was hidden from our eyes by clouds squeezed together on the horizon. Apparently, the jealous orb didn't want to reveal this inaccessible spot on the globe to any human being. Yet I decided to return to the Nautilus. We went along a steep, narrow path that ran over the cliff's summit. By 11:30 we had arrived at our landing place. The beached skiff had brought the captain ashore. I spotted him standing on a chunk of basalt. His instruments were beside him. His eyes were focused on the northern horizon, along which the sun was sweeping in its extended arc. I found a place near him and waited without speaking. Noon arrived, and just as on the day before, the sun didn't put in an appearance. It was sheer bad luck. Our noon sights were still lacking. If we couldn't obtain them tomorrow, we would finally have to give up any hope of fixing our position. In essence, it was precisely March 20th. Tomorrow, the 21st, was the day of the equinox. The sun would disappear below the horizon for 6 months, not counting refraction, and after its disappearance the long polar night would begin. Following the September equinox, the sun had emerged above the northerly horizon, rising in long spirals until December 21st. At that time, the summer solstice of these southernmost districts, the sun had started back down, and tomorrow it would cast its last rays. I shared my thoughts and fears with Captain Nemo. "You're right, Professor Aronnax," he told me. "If I can't take the sun's altitude tomorrow, I won't be able to try again for another 6 months. But, precisely because sailor's luck has led me into these seas on March 21st, it will be easy to get our bearings if the noonday sun does appear before our eyes." "Why easy, Captain?" "Because when the orb of day sweeps in such long spirals, it's difficult to measure its exact altitude above the horizon, and our instruments are open to committing serious errors." "Then what can you do?" "I use only my chronometer," Captain Nemo answered me. "At noon tomorrow, March 21st, if, after accounting for refraction, the sun's disk is cut exactly in half by the northern horizon, that will mean I'm at the South Pole." "Right," I said. "Nevertheless, it isn't a mathematically exact proof, because the equinoxes needn't fall precisely at noon." "No doubt, sir, but the error will be under 100 meters, and that's close enough for us. Until tomorrow, then." Captain Nemo went back on board. Conseil and I stayed behind until 5 o'clock, surveying the beach, observing and studying. The only unusual object I picked up was an auk's egg of remarkable size, for which a collector would have paid more than 1,000 francs. Its cream-colored tint, plus the streaks and markings that decorated it like so many hieroglyphics, made it a rare trinket. I placed it in Conseil's hands, and holding it like a precious porcelain from China, that cautious, sure-footed lad got it back to the Nautilus in one piece. There I put this rare egg inside one of the glass cases in the museum. I ate supper, feasting with an appetite on an excellent piece of seal liver whose flavor reminded me of pork. Then I went to bed, but not without praying, like a good Hindu, for the favors of the radiant orb. The next day, March 21st, bright and early at 5 o'clock in the morning, I climbed onto the platform. I found Captain Nemo there. "The weather is clearing a bit," he told me. "I have high hopes. After breakfast we'll make our way ashore and choose an observation post." This issue settled, I went to find Ned Land. I wanted to take him with me. The obstinate Canadian refused, and I could clearly see that his tight-lipped mood and his bad temper were growing by the day. Under the circumstances, I ultimately wasn't sorry that he refused. In truth, there were too many seals ashore, and it would never do to expose this impulsive fisherman to such temptations. Breakfast over, I made my way ashore. The Nautilus had gone a few more miles during the night. It lay well out, a good league from the coast, which was crowned by a sharp peak 400 to 500 meters high. In addition to me, the skiff carried Captain Nemo, 2 crewmen, and the instruments, in other words, a chronometer, a spyglass, and a barometer. During our crossing, I saw numerous baleen whales belonging to the 3 species unique to these southernmost seas: the bowhead whale, or right whale according to the English, which has no dorsal fin; the humpback whale, from the genus Balaenoptera, in other words, winged whales, beasts with wrinkled bellies and huge whitish fins that, genus name regardless, do not yet form wings; and the finback whale, yellowish-brown, the swiftest of all cetaceans. This powerful animal is audible from far away when it sends up towering spouts of air and steam that resemble swirls of smoke. Herds of these different mammals were playing about in the tranquil waters, and I could easily see that this Antarctic polar basin now served as a refuge for those cetaceans too relentlessly pursued by hunters. I also noted long, whitish strings of salps, a type of mollusk found in clusters, and some jellyfish of large size that swayed in the eddies of the billows. By 9 o'clock we had pulled up to shore. The sky was growing brighter. Clouds were fleeing to the south. Mists were rising from the cold surface of the water. Captain Nemo headed toward the peak, which he no doubt planned to make his observatory. It was an arduous climb over sharp lava and pumice stones in the midst of air often reeking with sulphurous fumes from the smoke holes. For a man out of practice at treading land, the captain scaled the steepest slopes with a supple agility I couldn't equal, and which would have been envied by hunters of Pyrenees mountain goats. It took us 2 hours to reach the summit of this half-crystal, half-basalt peak. From there our eyes scanned a vast sea, which scrawled its boundary line firmly against the background of the northern sky. At our feet, dazzling tracts of white. Over our heads, a pale azure, clear of mists. North of us, the sun's disk, like a ball of fire already cut into by the edge of the horizon. From the heart of the waters, jets of liquid rising like hundreds of magnificent bouquets. Far off, like a sleeping cetacean, the Nautilus. Behind us, to the south and east, an immense shore, a chaotic heap of rocks and ice whose limits we couldn't see. Arriving at the summit of this peak, Captain Nemo carefully determined its elevation by means of his barometer, since he had to take this factor into account in his noon sights. At 11:45 the sun, by then seen only by refraction, looked like a golden disk, dispersing its last rays over this deserted continent and down to these seas not yet plowed by the ships of man. Captain Nemo had brought a spyglass with a reticular eyepiece, which corrected the sun's refraction by means of a mirror, and he used it to observe the orb sinking, little by little, along a very extended diagonal that reached below the horizon. I held the chronometer. My heart was pounding mightily. If the lower half of the sun's disk disappeared just as the chronometer said noon, we were right at the pole. "Noon!" I called. The South Pole. Captain Nemo replied in a solemn voice, handing me the spyglass, which showed the orb of day cut into two exactly equal parts by the horizon. I stared at the last rays wreathing this peak, while shadows were gradually climbing its gradients. Just then, resting his hand on my shoulder, Captain Nemo said to me, "In 1600, sir, the Dutchman Gerrit was swept by storms and currents, reaching latitude 64 degrees south and discovering the South Shetland Islands. On January 17th, 1773, the famous Captain Cook went along the 38th meridian, arriving at latitude 67 degrees 30 minutes. And on January 30th, 1774, along the 109th meridian he reached latitude 71 degrees 15 minutes. In 1819 the Russian Bellinghausen lay on the 69th parallel, and in 1821 on the 66th at longitude 111 degrees west. In 1820 the Englishman Bransfield stopped at 65 degrees. That same year the American Morrell, whose reports are dubious, went along the 42nd meridian, finding open sea at latitude 70 degrees 14 minutes. In 1825 the Englishman Powell was unable to get beyond 62 degrees. That same year a humble seal fisherman, the Englishman Weddell, went as far as latitude 72 degrees 14 minutes on the 35th meridian, and as far as 74 degrees 15 minutes on the 36th. In 1829 the Englishman Forster, commander of the Chanticleer, laid claim to the Antarctic continent in latitude 63 degrees 26 minutes and longitude 66 degrees 26 minutes. On February 1st, 1831, the Englishman Biscoe discovered Enderby Land at latitude 68 degrees 50 minutes, Adelaide Land at latitude 67 degrees on February 5th, 1832, and Graham Land at latitude 64 degrees 45 minutes on February 21st. In 1838 the Frenchman Dumont d'Urville stopped at the Ice Bank in latitude 62 degrees 57 minutes, sighting the Louis-Philippe Peninsula. On January 21st, 2 years later, at a new southerly position of 66 degrees 30 minutes, he named the Adélie coast, and 8 days later the Claye coast at 64 degrees 40 minutes. In 1838 the American Wilkes advanced as far as the 69th parallel on the 100th meridian. In 1839 the Englishman Balleny discovered the Sabrina coast at the edge of the polar circle. Lastly, on January 12, 1842, with his ships the Erebus and the Terror, the Englishman Sir James Clark Ross found Victoria Land in latitude 70 degrees 56 minutes and longitude 171 degrees 7 minutes east. On the 23rd of that same month he reached the 74th parallel, a position denoting the farthest south attained until then. On the 27th he lay at 76 degrees 8 minutes, on the 28th at 77 degrees 32 minutes, on February 2nd at 78 degrees 4 minutes, and late in 1842 he returned to 71 degrees, but couldn't get beyond it. Well now, in 1868, on this 21st day of March, I myself, Captain Nemo, have reached the South Pole at 90 degrees, and I hereby claim this entire part of the globe, equal to 1/6 of the known continents." "In the name of which sovereign, Captain?" "In my own name, sir." So saying, Captain Nemo unfurled a black flag bearing a gold N on its quartered bunting. Then, turning toward the orb of day, whose last rays were licking at the sea's horizon, "Farewell, O sun!" he called. "Disappear, O radiant orb! Retire beneath this open sea, and let 6 months of night spread their shadows over my new domains." End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15. Accident or Incident. The next day, March 22nd, at 6 o'clock in the morning, preparations for departure began. The last gleams of twilight were melting into the night. The cold was brisk. The constellations were glittering with startling intensity. The wonderful Southern Cross, polar star of the Antarctic regions, twinkled at its zenith. The thermometer marked -12 degrees centigrade, and a fresh breeze left a sharp nip in the air. Ice floes were increasing over the open water. The sea was starting to congeal everywhere. Numerous blackish patches were spreading over its surface, announcing the imminent formation of fresh ice. Obviously, this southernmost basin froze over during its 6-month winter and became utterly inaccessible. What happened to the whales during this period? No doubt they went beneath the ice bank to find more feasible seas. As for seals and walruses, they were accustomed to living in the harshest climates and stayed in these icy waterways. These animals know by instinct how to gouge holes in the ice fields and keep them continually open. They go to these holes to breathe. Once the birds have migrated northward to escape the cold, these marine mammals remain the sole lords of the polar continent. Meanwhile, the ballast tanks filled with water and the Nautilus sank slowly. At a depth of 1,000 feet, it stopped. Its propellers churned the waves and it headed due north at a speed of 15 miles per hour. Near the afternoon, it was already cruising under the immense frozen carapace of the ice bank. As a precaution, the panels in the lounge stayed closed, because the Nautilus's hull could run afoul of some submerged block of ice. So I spent the day putting my notes into final form. My mind was completely wrapped up in my memories of the pole. We had reached that inaccessible spot without facing exhaustion or danger, as if our seagoing passenger carriage had glided there on railroad tracks. And now, we had actually started our return journey. Did it still have comparable surprises in store for me? I felt sure it did. So inexhaustible is this series of underwater wonders. As it was, in 5.5 months since fate had brought us on board, we had cleared 14,000 leagues, and over this track, longer than the Earth's equator, so many fascinating or frightening incidents had beguiled our voyage. The hunting trip in Crespo forests, our running aground in the Torres Strait, the coral cemetery, the pearl fisheries of Ceylon, the Arabic tunnel, the fires of Santorini, those millions in the Bay of Vigo, Atlantis, the South Pole. During the night, all these memories crossed from one dream to the next, not giving my brain a moment's rest. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by a violent collision. I sat up in bed, listening in the darkness, and then was suddenly hurled into the middle of my stateroom. Apparently, the Nautilus had gone aground, then heeled over sharply. Leaning against the walls, I dragged myself down the gangways to the lounge, whose ceiling lights were on. The furniture had been knocked over. Fortunately, the glass cases were solidly secured at the base and had stood fast. Since we were no longer vertical, the starboard pictures were glued to the tapestries, while those to port had their lower edges hanging a foot away from the wall. So the Nautilus was lying on its starboard side, completely stationary to boot. In its interior I heard the sound of footsteps and muffled voices, but Captain Nemo didn't appear. Just as I was about to leave the lounge, Ned Land and Conseil entered. "What happened?" I instantly said to them. "I came to ask Master that," Conseil replied. "Damnation!" the Canadian explained. "I know full well what happened. The Nautilus has gone aground. And judging from the way it's listing, I don't think it'll pull through like the first time in the Torres Strait." "But," I asked, "are we at least back on the surface of the sea?" "We have no idea," Conseil replied. "It's easy to find out," I answered. I consulted the pressure gauge. Much to my surprise, it indicated a depth of 360 meters. "What's the meaning of this?" I exclaimed. "We must confer with Captain Nemo," Conseil said. "But where do we find him?" Ned Land asked. "Follow me," I told my two companions. We left the lounge. Nobody in the library, nobody by the central companionway or the crew's quarters. I assumed that Captain Nemo was stationed in the pilot house. Best to wait. The three of us returned to the lounge. I'll skip over the Canadian's complaints. He had good grounds for an outburst. I didn't answer him back, letting him blow off all the steam he wanted. We had been left to ourselves for 20 minutes, trying to detect the tiniest noises inside the Nautilus, when Captain Nemo entered. He didn't seem to see us. His facial features, usually so emotionless, revealed a certain uneasiness. He studied the compass and the pressure gauge in silence, then went and put his fingers on the world map at a spot in the sector depicting the southernmost seas. I hesitated to interrupt him, but some moments later, when he turned to me, I threw back at him a phrase he had used in the Torres Strait. "An incident, Captain?" "No, sir," he replied. "This time an accident. Serious? Perhaps." "Is there any immediate danger?" "No." "The Nautilus has run aground?" "Yes." "And this accident came about?" "Through nature's unpredictability, not man's incapacity. No errors were committed in our maneuvers. Nevertheless, we can't prevent a loss of balance from taking its toll. One may defy human laws, but no one can withstand the laws of nature." Captain Nemo had picked an odd time to philosophize. All in all, this reply told me nothing. "May I learn, sir," I asked him, "what caused this accident?" "An enormous block of ice, an entire mountain, has toppled over," he answered me. "When an iceberg is eroded at the base by warmer waters or by repeated collisions, its center of gravity rises. Then it somersaults. It turns completely upside down. That's what happened here. When it overturned, one of these blocks hit the Nautilus as it was cruising under the waters. Sliding under the hull, this block then raised us with irresistible power, lifting us into less congested strata, where we now lie on our side." "But can't we float the Nautilus clear by emptying its ballast tanks to regain our balance?" "That, sir, is being done right now. You can hear the pumps working. Look at the needle on the pressure gauge. It indicates that the Nautilus is rising. But this block of ice is rising with us, and until some obstacle halts its upward movement, our position won't change." Indeed, the Nautilus kept the same heel to starboard. No doubt it would straighten up once the block came to a halt. But before that happened, who knew if we might not hit the underbelly of the ice bank and be hideously squeezed between two frozen surfaces? I mused on all the consequences of this situation. Captain Nemo didn't stop studying the pressure gauge. Since the toppling of this iceberg, the Nautilus had risen about 150 feet. Suddenly, a slight movement could be felt over the hull. Obviously, the Nautilus was straightening a bit. Objects hanging in the lounge were visibly returning to their normal positions. The walls were approaching the vertical. Nobody said a word. Hearts pounding, we could see and feel the ship righting itself. The floor was becoming horizontal beneath our feet. 10 minutes went by. "Finally, we're upright," I exclaimed. "Yes," Captain Nemo said, heading to the lounge door. "But will we float off?" I asked him. "Certainly," he replied, "since the ballast tanks aren't empty yet. And when they are, the Nautilus must rise to the surface of the sea." The captain went out, and soon I saw that at his orders the Nautilus had halted its upward movement. In fact, it soon would have hit the underbelly of the ice bank, but it had stopped in time and was floating in mid-water. "That was a close call," Conseil said. "Yes. We could have been crushed between these masses of ice, or at least imprisoned between them. And then, with no way to renew our air supply—" "Yes, that was a close call." "If it's Overworth," Ned Land muttered. I was unwilling to get into a pointless argument with the Canadian, and didn't reply. Moreover, the panels opened just then, and the outside light burst through the uncovered windows. We were fully afloat, as I have said, but on both sides of the Nautilus, about 10 meters away, there rose dazzling walls of ice. There also were walls above and below. Above, because the ice bank's underbelly spread over us like an immense ceiling. Below, because the somersaulting block, shifting little by little, had found points of purchase on the both side walls and had gotten jammed between them. The Nautilus was imprisoned in a genuine tunnel of ice, about 20 meters wide and filled with quiet water. So the ship could easily exit by going either ahead or astern, sinking a few hundred meters deeper, and then taking an open passageway beneath the ice bank. The ceiling lights were off, yet the lounge was still brightly lit. This was due to the reflecting power of the walls of ice, which threw the beams of our beacon right back at us. Words cannot describe the effects produced by our galvanic rays on these huge, whimsically sculptured blocks, whose every angle, ridge, and facet gave off a different glow depending upon the nature of the veins running inside the ice. It was a dazzling mine of gems, in particular sapphires and emeralds, whose jets of blue and green crisscrossed. Here and there, opaline hues of infinite subtlety raced among sparks of light that were like so many fiery diamonds, their brilliance more than any eye could stand. The power of our beacon was increased 100-fold, like a lamp shining through biconvex lenses of a world-class lighthouse. "How beautiful," Conseil explained. "Yes," I said, "it's a wonderful sight, isn't it, Ned?" "Oh, damnation, yes," Ned Land shot back. "It's superb. I'm furious that I have to admit it. No one has ever seen the like. But this sight could cost us dearly. And in all honesty, I think we're looking at things God never intended for human eyes." Ned was right. It was too beautiful. All at once, a yell from Conseil made me turn around. "What is it?" I asked. "Master must close his eyes. Master mustn't look." With that, Conseil clapped his hands over his eyes. "But what's wrong, my boy?" "I've been dazzled, struck blind." Involuntarily, my eyes flew to the window, but I couldn't stand the fire devouring it. I realized what had happened. The Nautilus had just started off at great speed. All the tranquil glimmers of the ice walls had then changed into blazing streaks. The sparkles from these myriad of diamonds were merging with each other. Swept along by its propeller, the Nautilus was traveling through a sheath of flashing light. Then the panels in the lounge closed. We kept our hands over our eyes, which were utterly saturated with those concentric gleams that swirl before the retina when the sunlight strikes too intensely. It took some time to calm our troubled vision. Finally, we lowered our hands. "Ye gods, I never would have believed it," Conseil said. "And I still don't believe it," the Canadian shot back. "When we return to shore, jaded from all these wonders," Conseil added, "think how we'll look down on those pitiful land masses, those puny works of man. No, the civilized world won't be good enough for us." Such words from the lips of this emotionless Flemish boy showed that our enthusiasm was near the boiling point. But the Canadian didn't fail to throw his dram of cold water over us. "The civilized world," he said, shaking his head. "Don't worry, Conseil, my friend. We're never going back to that world." By this point, it was 5 o'clock in the morning. Just then, there was a collision in the Nautilus's bow. I realized that its spur had just bumped a block of ice. It must have been a faulty maneuver, because this underwater tunnel was obstructed by such blocks and didn't make for easy navigating. So I had assumed that Captain Nemo, in adjusting his course, would go around each obstacle or would hug the walls and follow the winding of the tunnel. In either case, our forward motion wouldn't receive an absolute check. Nevertheless, contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus definitely began to move backwards. "We're going astern?" Conseil said. "Yes," I replied. "Apparently the tunnel has no way out at this end." "And so?" "So," I said, "our maneuvers are quite simple. We'll return in our tracks and go out the southern opening. That's all." As I spoke, I tried to sound more confident than I really felt. Meanwhile, the Nautilus accelerated its backward movement, and running with propeller in reverse, it swept us along at great speed. "This'll mean a delay," Ned said. "What are a few hours more or less, so long as we get out?" "Yes," Ned Land repeated, "so long as we get out." I strolled for a little while from the lounge into the library. My companions kept their seats and didn't move. Soon I threw myself down on a couch and picked up a book, which my eyes skimmed mechanically. A quarter of an hour later, Conseil approached me, saying, "Is it deeply fascinating, this volume Master is reading?" "Tremendously fascinating," I replied. "I believe it. Master is reading his own book." "My own book?" Indeed, my hands were holding my own work on the great ocean depths. I hadn't even suspected. I closed the book and resumed my strolling. Ned and Conseil stood up to leave. "Stay here, my friends," I said, stopping them. "Let's stay together until we're out of this blind alley." "As master wishes," Conseil replied. The hours passed. I often studied the instruments hanging on the lounge wall. The pressure gauge indicated that the Nautilus stayed at a constant depth of 300 meters. The compass, that it kept heading south. The log, that it was traveling at a speed of 20 miles per hour, an excessive speed in such a cramped area. But Captain Nemo knew that by this point there was no such thing as too fast, since minutes were now worth centuries. At 8:25 a second collision took place, this time astern. I grew pale. My companions came over. I clutched Conseil's hand. Our eyes questioned each other, and more directly than if our thoughts had been translated into words. Just then the captain entered the lounge. I went to him. "Our path is barred to the south?" I asked him. "Yes, sir. When it overturned, that iceberg closed off every exit. We're boxed in?" "Yes." End of chapter 15.
Second part, Chapter 16. Shortage of air. Consequently, above, below, and around the Nautilus there were impenetrable frozen walls. We were the ice bank's prisoners. The Canadian banged a table with his fearsome fist. Conseil kept still. I stared at the captain. His face had resumed its usual emotionlessness. He crossed his arms. He pondered. The Nautilus did not stir. The captain then broke into speech. "Gentlemen," he said, in a calm voice, "there are two ways of dying under the conditions in which we are placed." This inexplicable individual acted like a mathematics professor working out a problem for his pupils. "The first way," he went on, "is death by crushing. The second is death by asphyxiation. I don't mention the possibility of death by starvation because the Nautilus's provisions will certainly last longer than we will. Therefore, let's concentrate on our chances of being crushed or asphyxiated." "As for asphyxiation, Captain," I replied, "that isn't a cause for alarm because the air tanks are full." "True," Captain Nemo went on, "but they'll supply air for only 2 days. Now then, we've been buried beneath the waters for 36 hours, and the Nautilus's heavy atmosphere already needs renewing. In another 48 hours our reserve air will be used up. Well then, Captain, let's free ourselves within 48 hours. "We'll try to at least, by cutting through one of these walls surrounding us." "Which one?" I asked. "Borings will tell us that. I'm going to ground the Nautilus on the lower shelf. Then my men will put on their diving suits and attack the thinnest of these ice walls." "Can the panels in the lounge be left open?" "Without ill effect. We're no longer in motion." Captain Nemo went out. Hissing sounds soon told me that water was being admitted into the ballast tanks. The Nautilus slowly settled and rested on the icy bottom at a depth of 350 meters, the depth at which the lower shelf of ice lay submerged. "My friends," I said, "we are in a serious predicament, but I'm counting on your courage and energy." "Sir," the Canadian replied, "this is no time to bore you with my complaints. I'm ready to do anything I can for the common good." "Excellent, Ned," I said, extending my hand to the Canadian. "I might add," he went on, "that I'm as handy with a pick as a harpoon. If I can be helpful to the captain, he can use me any way he wants." "He won't turn down your assistance. Come along, Ned." I led the Canadian to the room where the Nautilus's men were putting on their diving suits. I informed the captain of Ned's proposition, which was promptly accepted. The Canadian got into his underwater costume and was ready as soon as his fellow workers. Each of them carried on his back a récréation device that the air tanks had supplied with a generous allowance of fresh oxygen, a considerable but necessary drain on the Nautilus's reserves. As for the Ruhmkorff lamps, they were unnecessary in the midst of these brilliant waters, saturated with our electric rays. After Ned was dressed, I re-entered the lounge, whose windows had been uncovered. Stationed next to Conseil, I examined the strata surrounding and supporting the Nautilus. Some moments later we saw a dozen crewmen set foot on the shelf of ice, among them Ned Land, easily recognized by his tall figure. Captain Nemo was with them. Before digging into the ice, the captain had to obtain borings, to ensure working in the best direction. Long bores were driven into the side walls, but after 15 meters, the instruments were still impeded by the thickness of those walls. It was futile to attack the ceilings, since that surface was the ice bank itself, more than 400 meters high. Captain Nemo then bored into the lower surface. There we were separated from the sea by a 10-meter barrier. That's how thick the iceberg was. From this point on, it was an issue of cutting out a piece equal in surface area to the Nautilus's waterline. This meant detaching about 6,500 cubic meters, to dig a hole through which the ship could descend below this tract of ice. Work began immediately and was carried on with tireless tenacity. Instead of digging all around the Nautilus, which would have entailed even greater difficulties, Captain Nemo had an immense trench outlined on the ice 8 meters from our port quarter. Then his men simultaneously staked it off at several points around its circumference. Soon their picks were vigorously attacking this compact matter, and huge chunks were loosened from its mass. These chunks weighed less than the water, and by an unusual effect of specific gravity, each chunk took wing, as it were, to the roof of the tunnel, which thickened above by as much as it was diminished below. But this hardly mattered so long as the lower surface kept growing thinner. After 2 hours of energetic work, Ned Land re-entered, exhausted. He and his companions were replaced by new workmen, including Conseil and me. The Nautilus's chief officer supervised us. The water struck me as unusually cold, but I warmed up promptly while wielding my pick. My movements were quite free, although they were executed under a pressure of 30 atmospheres. After 2 hours of work, re-entering to snatch some food and rest, I found a noticeable difference between the clean, elastic fluid supplied me by the Rouquayrol device and the Nautilus's atmosphere, which was already charged with carbon dioxide. The air hadn't been renewed in 48 hours, and its life-giving qualities were considerably weakened. Meanwhile, after 12 hours had gone by, we had removed from the outlined surface area a slice of ice only 1 meter thick, hence about 600 cubic meters. Assuming the same work would be accomplished every 12 hours, it would still take 5 nights and 4 days to see the undertaking through to completion. 5 nights and 4 days, I told my companions, and we have oxygen in the air tanks for only 2 days. Without taking into account, Ned answered, that once we're out of this damned prison we'll still be cooped up beneath the ice bank, without any possible contact with the open air. An apt remark, for who could predict the minimum time we would need to free ourselves? Before the Nautilus could return to the surface of the waves, couldn't we all die of asphyxiation? Were this ship and everyone on board doomed to perish in this tomb of ice? It was a dreadful state of affairs, but we faced it head-on, each one of us determined to do his duty to the end. During the night, in line with my forecasts, a new 1-meter slice was removed from this immense socket. But in the morning, wearing my diving suit, I was crossing through the liquid mass in a temperature of -6 degrees to -7 degrees centigrade, when I noted that little by little the side walls were closing in on each other. The liquid strata farthest from the trench, not warmed by the movements of workmen and tools, were showing a tendency to solidify. In the face of this imminent new danger, what would happen to our chances for salvation, and how could we prevent this liquid medium from solidifying, then cracking the Nautilus's hull like glass? I didn't tell my 2 companions about this new danger. There was no point in dampening the energy they were putting into our arduous rescue work, but when I returned on board, I mentioned this serious complication to Captain Nemo. "I know," he told me, in that calm tone the most dreadful outlook couldn't change. "It's one more danger, but I don't know any way of warding it off. Our sole chance of salvation is to work faster than the water solidifies. We've got to get there first, that's all." Get there first. By then I should have been used to this type of talk. For several hours that day I wielded my pick doggedly. The work kept me going. Besides, working meant leaving the Nautilus, which meant breathing the clean oxygen drawn from the air tanks and supplied by our equipment, which meant leaving the thin, foul air behind. Near evening 1 more meter had been dug from the trench. When I returned on board, I was well nigh asphyxiated by the carbon dioxide saturating the air. Oh, if only we had the chemical methods that would enable us to drive out this noxious gas! There was no lack of oxygen. All this water contained a considerable amount, and after it was decomposed by our powerful batteries, this life-giving elastic fluid could have been restored to us. I had thought it all out, but to no avail, because the carbon dioxide produced by our breathing permeated every part of the ship. To absorb it, we would need to fill containers with potassium hydroxide and shake them continually. But this substance was missing on board, and nothing else could replace it. That evening Captain Nemo was forced to open the spigots of his air tanks and shoot a few spouts of fresh oxygen through the Nautilus's interior. Without this precaution, we wouldn't have awakened the following morning. The next day, March 26, I returned to my miner's trade, working to remove the 5th meter. The ice banks, side walls, and underbelly had visibly thickened. Obviously they would come together before the Nautilus could break free. For an instant I was gripped by despair. My pick nearly slipped from my hands. What was the point of this digging if I was to die smothered and crushed by this water turning to stone, a torture undreamed of by even the wildest savages? I felt like I was lying in the jaws of a fearsome monster, jaws irresistibly closing. Supervising our work, working himself, Captain Nemo passed near me just then. I touched him with my hand and pointed to the walls of our prison. The starboard wall had moved forward to a point less than 4 meters from the Nautilus's hull. The captain understood and gave me a signal to follow him. We returned on board. My diving suit removed, I went with him to the lounge. "Professor Aronnax," he told me, "this calls for heroic measures, or we'll be sealed up in this solidified water as if it were cement." "Yes," I said, "but what can we do?" "Oh," he exclaimed, "if only my Nautilus were strong enough to stand that much pressure without being crushed." "Well?" I asked, not catching the captain's meaning. "Don't you understand," he went on, "that the congealing of this water could come to our rescue? Don't you see that by solidifying it could burst these tracts of ice imprisoning us, just as its freezing can burst the hardest stones? Aren't you aware that this force could be the instrument of our salvation rather than our destruction?" "Yes, Captain, maybe so, but whatever resistance to crushing the Nautilus may have, it still couldn't stand such dreadful pressures, and it would be squashed as flat as a piece of sheet iron." "I know it, sir. So we can't rely on nature to rescue us, only our own efforts. We must counteract this solidification. We must hold it in check. Not only are the side walls closing in, but there aren't 10 feet of water ahead or astern of the Nautilus. All around us this freeze is gaining fast." "How long," I asked, "will the oxygen in the air tanks enable us to breathe on board?" The captain looked me straight in the eye. "After tomorrow," he said, "the air tanks will be empty." I broke out in a cold sweat, but why should I have been startled by this reply? On March 22nd the Nautilus had dived under the open waters at the pole. It was now the 26th. We had lived off the ship's stores for 5 days, and all remaining breathable air had to be saved for the workmen. Even today, as I write these lines, my sensations are so intense that an involuntary terror sweeps over me, and my lungs still seem short of air. Meanwhile, motionless and silent, Captain Nemo stood lost in thought. An idea visibly crossed his mind, but he seemed to brush it aside. He told himself, no. At last these words escaped his lips. "Boiling water," he muttered. "Boiling water?" I exclaimed. "Yes, sir. We're shut up in a relatively confined area. If the Nautilus's pumps continually injected streams of boiling water into this space, wouldn't that raise its temperature and delay its freezing?" "It's worth trying," I said resolutely. "So let's try it, Professor." By then the thermometer gave -7 degrees centigrade outside. Captain Nemo led me to the galley where a huge distilling mechanism was at work, supplying drinking water via evaporation. The mechanism was loaded with water, and the full electric heat of our batteries was thrown into coils awash in liquid. In a few minutes the water reached 100 degrees centigrade. It was sent to the pumps while new water replaced it in the process. The heat generated by our batteries was so intense that after simply going through the mechanism, water drawn cold from the sea arrived, boiling hot, at the body of the pump. The steaming water was injected into the icy water outside, and after 3 hours had passed, the thermometer gave the exterior temperature as -6 degrees centigrade. That was 1 degree gained. 2 hours later the thermometer gave only -4 degrees. After I monitored the operation's progress, double-checking it with many inspections, I told the captain, "It's working." "I think so," he answered me. "We've escaped being crushed. Now we have only asphyxiation to fear." During the night the water temperature rose to -1 degrees centigrade. The injections couldn't get it to go a single degree higher, but since salt water freezes only at -2 degrees, I was finally assured that there was no danger of it solidifying. By the next day, March 27, 6 meters of ice had been torn from the socket. Only 4 meters were left to be removed. That still meant 48 hours of work. The air couldn't be renewed in the Nautilus's interior. Accordingly, that day it kept getting worse. An unbearable heaviness weighed me down. Near 3 o'clock in the afternoon this agonizing sensation affected me to an intense degree. Yawns dislocated my jaws. My lungs were gasping in their quest for that enkindling elastic fluid required for breathing, now growing scarcer and scarcer. My mind was in a daze. I lay outstretched, strength gone, nearly unconscious. My gallant Conseil felt the same symptoms, suffered the same sufferings, yet never left my side. He held my hand, he kept encouraging me, and I even heard him mutter, "Oh, if only I didn't have to breathe, to leave more air for master." It brought tears to my eyes to hear him say these words. Since conditions inside were universally unbearable, how eagerly, how happily we put on our diving suits to take turns working! Picks rang out on that bed of ice, arms grew weary, hands were rubbed raw, but who cared about exhaustion? What difference were wounds? Life-sustaining air reached our lungs. We could breathe. We could breathe. And yet nobody prolonged his underwater work beyond the time allotted him. His shift over, each man surrendered to a gasping companion the air tank that would revive him. Captain Nemo set the example and was foremost in submitting to this strict discipline. When his time was up, he yielded his equipment to another and re-entered the foul air on board, always calm, unflinching, and uncomplaining. That day the usual work was accomplished with even greater energy. Over the whole surface area only 2 meters were left to be removed. Only 2 meters separated us from the open sea, but the ship's air tanks were nearly empty. The little air that remained had to be saved for the workmen, not an atom for the Nautilus. When I returned on board, I felt half suffocated. What a night! I'm unable to depict it. Such sufferings are indescribable. The next day I was short-winded. Headaches and staggering fits of dizziness made me reel like a drunk. My companions were experiencing the same symptoms. Some crewmen were at their last gasp. That day, the 6th of our imprisonment, Captain Nemo concluded that picks and mattocks were too slow to deal with the ice layer still separating us from open water, and he decided to crush this layer. The man had kept his energy and composure. He had subdued physical pain with moral strength. He could still think, plan, and act. At his orders the craft was eased off. In other words, it was raised from its icy bed by a change in its specific gravity. When it was afloat, the crew towed it, leading it right above the immense trench outlined to match the ship's water line. Next, the ballast tanks filled with water. The boat sank and was fitted into its socket. Just then the whole crew returned on board, and the double outside door was closed. By this point the Nautilus was resting on a bed of ice only 1 meter thick, and drilled by bores in 1,000 places. The stopcocks of the ballast tanks were then opened wide, and 100 cubic meters of water rushed in, increasing the Nautilus's weight by 100,000 kilograms. We waited, we listened, we forgot our sufferings. We hoped once more we had staked our salvation on this one last gamble. Despite the buzzing in my head, I soon could hear vibrations under the Nautilus's hull. We tilted. The ice cracked with an odd ripping sound like paper tearing, and the Nautilus began settling downward. "We're going through," Conseil muttered in my ear. I couldn't answer him. I clutched his hand. I squeezed it in an involuntary convulsion. All at once, carried away by its frightful excess load, the Nautilus sank into the waters like a cannonball. In other words, dropping as if in a vacuum. Our full electric power was then put on the pumps, which instantly began to expel water from the ballast tanks. After a few minutes we had checked our fall. The pressure gauge soon indicated an ascending movement. Brought to full speed, the propeller made the sheet iron hull tremble down to its rivets, and we sped northward. But how long would it take to navigate under the ice bank to the open sea? Another day? I would be dead first. Half lying on a couch in the library, I was suffocating. My face was purple, my lips blue, my faculties in abeyance. I could no longer see or hear. I had lost all sense of time. My muscles had no power to contract. I'm unable to estimate the hours that passed in this way, but I was aware that my death throes had begun. I realized that I was about to die. Suddenly I regained consciousness. A few whiffs of air had entered my lungs. Had we risen to the surface of the waves? Had we cleared the ice bank? No. Ned and Conseil, my two gallant friends, were sacrificing themselves to save me. A few atoms of air were still left in the depths of one Rouquayrol device. Instead of breathing it themselves, they had saved it for me, and while they were suffocating, they poured life into me drop by drop. I tried to push the device away. They held my hands, and for a few moments I could breathe luxuriously. My eyes flew toward the clock. It was 11 in the morning. It had to be March 28. The Nautilus was traveling at the frightful speed of 40 miles per hour. It was writhing in the waters. Where was Captain Nemo? Had he perished? Had his companions died with him? Just then the pressure gauge indicated that we were no more than 20 feet from the surface. Separating us from the open air was a mere tract of ice. Could we break through it? Perhaps. In any event, the Nautilus was going to try. In fact, I could feel it assuming an oblique position, lowering its stern and raising its spur. The admission of additional water was enough to shift its balance. Then, driven by its powerful propeller, it attacked this ice field from below like a fearsome battering ram. It split the barrier little by little, backing up, then putting on full speed against the punctured tract of ice, and finally, carried away by its supreme momentum, it lunged through and onto this frozen surface, crushing the ice beneath its weight. The hatches were opened, or torn off if you prefer, and waves of clean air were admitted into every part of the Nautilus. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17. From Cape Horn to the Amazon. How I got onto the platform I'm unable to say. Perhaps the Canadian transferred me there, but I could breathe. I could inhale the life-giving sea air. Next to me, my two companions were getting tipsy on the fresh oxygen particles. Poor souls who have suffered from long starvation mustn't pounce heedlessly on the first food given them. We, on the other hand, didn't have to practice such moderation. We could suck the atoms from the air by the lungful, and it was the breeze itself that poured into us this luxurious intoxication. "Ah!" Conseil was putting in. "What fine oxygen! Let master have no fears about breathing. There's enough for everyone." As for Ned Land, he didn't say a word, but his wide-open jaws would have scared off a shark. And what powerful inhalations! The Canadian drew like a furnace going full blast. Our strength returned promptly, and when I looked around I saw that we were alone on the platform. No crewmen, not even Captain Nemo. Those strange seamen on the Nautilus were content with the oxygen circulating inside. Not one of them had come up to enjoy the open air. The first words I pronounced were words of appreciation and gratitude to my two companions. Ned and Conseil had kept me alive during the final hours of our long death throes, but no expression of thanks could repay them fully for such devotion. "Good Lord, Professor," Ned Land answered me. "Don't mention it. What did we do that's so praiseworthy? Not a thing. It was a question of simple arithmetic. Your life is worth more than ours, so we had to save it." "No, Ned," I replied, "it isn't worth more. Nobody could be better than a kind and generous man like yourself." All right," the Canadian repeated in embarrassment. "And you, my gallant Conseil, you suffered a great deal." "Not too much, to be candid with master. I was lacking a few throatfuls of air, but I would have gotten by. Besides, when I saw master fainting, it left me without the slightest desire to breathe. It took my breath away in a manner of—" Confounded by this lapse into banality, Conseil left his sentence hanging. "My friends," I replied, very moved, "we're bound to each other forever, and I'm deeply indebted to you." "Which I'll take advantage of," the Canadian shot back. "Eh?" Conseil put in. "Yes," Ned Land went on, "you can repay your debt by coming with me when I leave this infernal Nautilus." "By the way," Conseil said, "are we going in a favorable direction?" "Yes," I replied, "because we're going in the direction of the sun, and here the sun is due north." "Sure," Ned Land went on, "but it remains to be seen whether we'll make for the Atlantic or the Pacific. In other words, whether we'll end up in well-traveled or deserted seas." I had no reply to this, and I feared that Captain Nemo wouldn't take us homeward, but rather into that huge ocean washing the shores of both Asia and America. In this way he would complete his underwater tour of the world, going back to those seas where the Nautilus enjoyed the greatest freedom. But if we returned to the Pacific, far from every populated shore, what would happen to Ned Land's plans? We would soon settle this important point. The Nautilus traveled swiftly. Soon we had cleared the Antarctic Circle, plus the promontory of Cape Horn. We were abreast of the tip of South America by March 31 at 7 o'clock in the evening. By then all our past sufferings were forgotten. The memory of that imprisonment under the ice faded from our minds. We had thoughts only of the future. Captain Nemo no longer appeared, neither in the lounge nor on the platform. The positions reported each day on the world map were put there by the chief officer, and they enabled me to determine the Nautilus's exact heading. Now then, that evening, it became obvious, much to my satisfaction, that we were returning north by the Atlantic route. I shared the results of my observations with the Canadian and Conseil. "That's good news," the Canadian replied. "But where's the Nautilus going?" "I'm unable to say, Ned." "After the South Pole, does our captain want to tackle the North Pole, then go back to the Pacific by the notorious Northwest Passage?" "I wouldn't double-dare him," Conseil replied. "Ah, well," the Canadian said, "we'll give him the slip long before then." "In any event," Conseil added, "he's a superman, that Captain Nemo, and we'll never regret having known him." "Especially once we've left him," Ned Land shot back. The next day, April 1, when the Nautilus rose to the surface of the waves a few minutes before noon, we raised land to the west. It was Tierra del Fuego, the Land of Fire, a name given it by early navigators after they saw numerous curls of smoke rising from the natives' huts. This Land of Fire forms a huge cluster of islands over 30 leagues long and 80 leagues wide, extending between latitudes 53 degrees and 56 degrees south, and between longitude 67 degrees 50 minutes and 77 degrees 15 minutes west. Its coastline looked flat, but high mountains rose in the distance. I even thought I glimpsed Mount Sarmiento, whose elevation is 2,070 meters above sea level, a pyramid-shaped block of shale, with a very sharp summit, which, depending on whether it's clear or veiled in vapor, predicts fair weather or foul, as Ned Land told me. "A first-class barometer, my friend." "Yes, sir, a natural barometer that didn't let me down when I navigated the narrows of the Strait of Magellan." Just then its peak appeared before us, standing out distinctly against the background of the skies. This forecast fair weather, and so it proved. Going back under the waters, the Nautilus drew near the coast, cruising along it for only a few miles. Through the lounge windows I could see long creepers and gigantic fucus plants, bulb-bearing seaweed of which the open sea at the pole had revealed a few specimens. With their smooth, viscous filaments, they measured as much as 300 meters long, genuine cables more than an inch thick and very tough. They are often used as mooring lines for ships. Another weed, known by the name Velp, and boasting 4-foot leaves, was crammed into the coral concretions and carpeted the ocean floor. It served as both nest and nourishment for myriads of crustaceans and mollusks, for crabs and cuttlefish. Here seals and otters could indulge in a sumptuous meal, mixing meat from fish with vegetables from the sea, like the English with their Irish stews. The Nautilus passed over these lush, luxuriant depths with tremendous speed. Near evening it approached the Falkland Islands, whose rugged summits I recognized the next day. The sea was of moderate depth, so, not without good reason, I assumed that these 2 islands, plus the many islets surrounding them, used to be part of the Magellan coastline. The Falkland Islands were probably discovered by the famous navigator John Davis, who gave them the name Davis Southern Islands. Later, Sir Richard Hawkins called them the Maidenland, after the Blessed Virgin. Subsequently, at the beginning of the 18th century, they were named the Malouines by fishermen from St. Malo in Brittany, then finally dubbed the Falklands by the English, to whom they belong today. In these waterways our nets brought up fine samples of algae, in particular certain fucus plants whose roots were laden with the world's best mussels. Geese and duck alighted by the dozens on the platforms and soon took their places in the ship's pantry. As for fish, I specifically observed some bony fish belonging to the goby genus, especially some gudgeon 2 decimeters long, sprinkled with whitish and yellow spots. I likewise marveled at the numerous medusas, including the most beautiful of their breed, the compass jellyfish, unique to the Falkland Seas. Some of these jellyfish were shaped like very smooth, semi-spheric parasols with russet stripes and fringes of 12 neat festoons. Others looked like upside-down baskets from which wide leaves and long red twigs were gracefully trailing. They swam with quiverings of their 4 leaf-like arms, letting the opulent tresses of their tentacles dangle in the drift. I wanted to preserve a few specimens of these delicate zoophytes, but they were merely clouds, shadows, illusions melting and evaporating outside their native element. When the last tips of the Falkland Islands had disappeared below the horizon, the Nautilus submerged to a depth of between 20 and 25 meters, and went along the South American coast. Captain Nemo didn't put in an appearance. We didn't leave these Patagonian waterways until April 3, sometimes cruising under the ocean, sometimes on its surface. The Nautilus passed the wide estuary formed by the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, and on April 4 we lay abreast of Uruguay, albeit 50 miles out. Keeping to its northerly heading, it followed the long windings of South America. By then we had fared 16,000 leagues since coming on board in the seas of Japan. Near 11 o'clock in the morning we cut the Tropic of Capricorn on the 37th meridian, passing well out from Cape Frio. Much to Ned Land's displeasure, Captain Nemo had no liking for the neighborhood of Brazil's populous shores, because he shot by with dizzying speed. Not even the swiftest fish or birds could keep up with us, and the natural curiosities in these seas completely eluded our observation. This speed was maintained for several days, and on the evening of April 9 we raised South America's easternmost tip, Cape São Roque. But then the Nautilus veered away again and went looking for the lowest depths of an underwater valley gouged between this cape and Sierra Leone on the coast of Africa. Abreast of the West Indies, this valley forks into two arms, and to the north it ends in an enormous depression 9,000 meters deep. From this locality to the Lesser Antilles, the ocean's geologic profile features a steeply cut cliff, 6 kilometers high, and abreast of the Cape Verde Islands. There's another wall just as imposing. Together these two barricades confine the whole submerged continent of Atlantis. The floor of this immense valley is made picturesque by mountains that furnish these underwater depths with scenic views. This description is based mostly on certain hand-drawn charts kept in the Nautilus's library, charts obviously rendered by Captain Nemo himself, from his own personal observations. For 2 days we visited these deep and deserted waters by means of our slanting fins. The Nautilus would do long diagonal dives that took us to every level, but on April 11 it rose suddenly, and the shore reappeared at the mouth of the Amazon River, a huge estuary whose outflow is so considerable it desalts the sea over an area of several leagues. We cut the equator. 20 miles to the west lay Guiana, French territory, where we could easily have taken refuge. But the wind was blowing a strong gust, and the furious billows would not allow us to face them in a mere skiff. No doubt Ned Land understood this, because he said nothing to me. For my part, I made no allusion to his escape plans, because I didn't want to push him into an attempt that was certain to misfire. I was readily compensated for this delay by fascinating research. During those 2 days of April 11 to 12, the Nautilus didn't leave the surface of the sea, and its trawl brought up a simply miraculous catch of zoophytes, fish, and reptiles. Some zoophytes were dredged up by the chain of our trawl. Most were lovely sea anemone belonging to the family Actinidia, including among other species the Phyctalis protexta, native to this part of the ocean, a small cylindrical trunk adorned with vertical lines, mottled with red spots, and crowned by a wondrous blossoming of tentacles. As for mollusks, they consisted of exhibits I had already observed: turret snails, olive shells of the tent olive species with neatly intersecting lines and russet spots standing out sharply against a flesh-colored background, fanciful spider conchs that looked like petrified scorpions, transparent glass snails, argonauts, some highly edible cuttlefish, and certain species of squid that the naturalists of antiquity classified with the flying fish, which are used chiefly as bait for catching cod. As for the fish in these waterways, I noted various species that I hadn't yet had the opportunity to study. Among cartilaginous fish, some brook lamprey, a type of eel 15 inches long, head greenish, fins violet, back bluish-gray, belly a silvery brown strewn with bright spots, iris of the eye encircled in gold, unusual animals that the Amazon's current must have swept out to sea because their natural habitat is fresh water. Stingrays, the snout pointed, the tail long, slender, and armed with an extensive jagged sting. Small 1-meter sharks, with gray and whitish hides, their teeth arranged in several backward curving rows, fish commonly known by the name carpet shark. Batfish, a sort of reddish isosceles triangle, 1/2 meter long, whose pectoral fins are attached by fleshy extensions that make these fish look like bats, although an appendage made of horn, located near the nostrils, earns them the nickname of sea unicorns. Lastly, a couple species of triggerfish, the cucoyo, whose stippled flanks glitter with a sparkling gold color, and the bright purple leather jacket, whose hues glisten like a pigeon's throat. I'll finish up this catalogue, a little dry but quite accurate, with the series of bony fish I observed. Eels belonging to the genus Apteronotus, whose snow-white snout is very blunt, the body painted a handsome black and armed with a very long, slender, fleshy whip. Long sardines from the genus Odontognathus, like 3-decimeter pike, shining with a bright silver glow, Guaranian mackerel furnished with 2 anal fins, black-tinted rudderfish that you catch by using torches, fish measuring 2 meters and boasting white, firm, plump meat that, when fresh, tastes like eel, when dried, like smoked salmon. Semi-red wrasse, sporting scales only at the bases of their dorsal and anal fins. Grunts on which gold and silver mingle their luster with that of ruby and topaz. Yellow-tailed gilthead, whose flesh is extremely dainty, and whose phosphorescent properties give them away in the midst of the waters. Porgies tinted orange, with slender tongues, croakers with gold caudal fins, black surgeonfish, 4-eyed fish from Suriname, etc. This etc. won't keep me from mentioning one more fish that Conseil, with good reason, will long remember. One of our nets had hauled up a type of very flat ray that weighed some 20 kilograms. With its tail cut off, it would have formed a perfect disk. It was white underneath and reddish on top, with big round spots of deep blue encircled in black, its hide quite smooth and ending in a double-lobed fin. Laid out on the platform, it kept struggling with convulsive movements, trying to turn over, making such efforts that its final lunge was about to flip it into the sea, but Conseil, being very possessive of his fish, rushed at it, and before I could stop him, he seized it with both hands. Instantly there he was, thrown on his back, legs in the air, his body half paralyzed, and yelling. "Oh, sir, sir, will you help me?" For once in his life the poor lad didn't address me in the third person. The Canadian and I sat him up. We massaged his contracted arms, and when he regained his 5 senses, that eternal classifier mumbled in a broken voice, "Class of cartilaginous fish. Order Chondropterygia with fixed gills. Suborder Salacia. Family Regiforma. Genus Electric Ray." "Yes, my friend," I answered, "it was an electric ray that put you in this deplorable state." "Oh, master can trust me on this," Conseil shot back. "I'll be revenged on that animal." "How?" "I'll eat it." Which he did that same evening, but strictly as retaliation, because, frankly, it tasted like leather. Poor Conseil had assaulted an electric ray of the most dangerous species, the cumana. Living in a conducting medium such as water, this bizarre animal can electrocute other fish from several meters away. So great is the power of its electric organ, an organ whose 2 chief surfaces measure at least 27 square feet. During the course of the next day, April 12, the Nautilus drew near the coast of Dutch Guiana, by the mouth of the Maroni River. There several groups of sea cows were living in family units. These were manatees, which belonged to the order Sirenia. Like the dugong and Steller's sea cow, harmless and unaggressive, these fine animals were 6 to 7 meters long, and must have weighed at least 4,000 kilograms each. I told Ned Land and Conseil that far-seeing nature had given these mammals a major role to play. In essence, manatees, like seals, are designed to graze the underwater prairies, destroying the clusters of weeds that obstruct the mouths of tropical rivers. And do you know, I added, what happened since man has almost completely wiped out these beneficial races? Rotting weeds have poisoned the air, and this poisoned air causes the yellow fever that devastates these wonderful countries. This toxic vegetation has increased beneath the seas of the torrid zone, so the disease spreads unchecked from the mouth of the Rio de la Plata to Florida. And if Professor Toussaint is correct, this plague is nothing compared to the scourge that will strike our descendants once the seas are depopulated of whales and seals. By then, crowded with jellyfish, squid, and other devilfish, the oceans will have become huge centers of infection, because their waves will no longer possess these huge stomachs that God has entrusted with scouring the surface of the sea. Meanwhile, without scorning these theories, the Nautilus's crew captured 6 manatees. In essence, it was an issue of stocking the larder with excellent red meat, even better than beef or veal. Their hunting was not a fascinating sport. The manatees let themselves be struck down without offering any resistance. Several thousand kilos of meat were hauled below to be dried and stored. The same day an odd fishing practice further increased the Nautilus's stores, so full of game were these seas. Our trawl brought up in its meshes a number of fish whose heads were topped by little oval slabs with fleshy edges. These were suckerfish, from the third family of the Sabrachian Malacopterygii. These flat discs on their heads consist of crosswise plates of movable cartilage, between which the animals can create a vacuum, enabling them to stick to objects like suction cups. The remoras I had observed in the Mediterranean were related to this species, but the creature at issue here was an Echinaeus osteochara, unique to this sea. Right after catching them, our seamen dropped them in buckets of water. Its fishing finished, the Nautilus drew nearer to the coast. In this locality a number of sea turtles were sleeping on the surface of the waves. It would have been difficult to capture these valuable reptiles because they wake up at the slightest sound, and their solid carapaces are harpoon-proof. But our suckerfish would effect their capture with extraordinary certainty and precision. In truth, this animal is a living fishhook, promising wealth and happiness to the greenest fishermen in the business. The Nautilus's men attached to each fish's tail a ring that was big enough not to hamper its movements, and to this ring a long rope whose other end was moored on board. Thrown into the sea, the suckerfish immediately began to play their roles, going and fastening themselves onto the breastplates of the turtles. Their tenacity was so great they would rip apart rather than let go. They were hauled in, still sticking to the turtles that came aboard with them. In this way we caught several loggerheads, reptiles a meter wide and weighing 200 kilos. They're extremely valuable because of their carapaces, which are covered with big slabs of horn, thin, brown, transparent, with white and yellow markings. Besides, they were excellent from an edible viewpoint, with an exquisite flavor comparable to the green turtle. This fishing ended our stay in the waterways of the Amazon, and that evening the Nautilus took to the high seas once more.
Chapter 18. The Devilfish. For some days the Nautilus kept veering away from the American coast. It obviously didn't want to frequent the waves of the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean Sea. Yet there was no shortage of water under its keel, since the average depth of these seas is 1,800 meters. But these waterways, strewn with islands and ploughed by steamers, probably didn't agree with Captain Nemo. On April 16 we raised Martinique and Guadeloupe from a distance of about 30 miles. For one instant I could see their lofty peaks. The Canadian was quite disheartened, having counted on putting his plans into execution in the Gulf, either by reaching shore or by pulling alongside one of the many boats plying a coastal trade from one island to another. An escape attempt would have been quite feasible, assuming Ned Land managed to seize the skiff without the captain's knowledge, but in mid-ocean it was unthinkable. The Canadian, Conseil, and I had a pretty long conversation on this subject. For 6 months we had been prisoners aboard the Nautilus. We had fared 17,000 leagues, and as Ned Land put it, there was no end in sight. So he made me a proposition I hadn't anticipated. We were to ask Captain Nemo this question straight out. Did the captain mean to keep us on board his vessel permanently? This measure was distasteful to me. To my mind it would lead nowhere. We could hope for nothing from the Nautilus's commander, but could depend only on ourselves. Besides, for some time now the man had been gloomier, more withdrawn, less sociable. He seemed to be avoiding me. I encountered him only at rare intervals. He used to take pleasure in explaining the underwater wonders to me. Now he left me to research, and no longer entered the lounge. What changes had come over him? From what cause? I had no reason to blame myself. Was our presence on board perhaps a burden to him? Even so, I cherished no hopes that the man would set us free. So I begged Ned to let me think about it before taking action. If this measure proved fruitless, it could arouse the captain's suspicions, make our circumstances even more arduous, and jeopardize the Canadian's plans. I might add that I could hardly use our state of health as an argument. Except for that drooling ordeal under the ice bank at the South Pole, we had never felt better, neither Ned, Conseil, nor I. The nutritious food, life-giving air, regular routine, and uniform temperature kept illness at bay, and for a man who didn't miss his past existence on land, for Captain Nemo, who was at home here, who went where he wished, who took paths mysterious to others if not himself in attaining his ends, I could understand such a life. But we ourselves hadn't severed all ties with humanity. For my part, I didn't want my new and unusual research to be buried with my bones. I had now earned the right to pen a definitive book on the sea, and sooner or later I wanted that book to see the light of day. There once more, through the panels opening into these Caribbean waters, 10 meters below the surface of the waves, I found so many fascinating exhibits to describe in my daily notes. Among other zoophytes, there were Portuguese men of war, known by the name Phasalia pelagica, like big oblong bladders, with a pearly sheen, spreading their membranes to the wind, letting their blue tentacles drift like silken threads. To the eye, delightful jellyfish; to the touch, actual nettles that ooze a corrosive liquid. Among the articulates, there were annelid worms, 1.5 meters long, furnished with a pink proboscis, equipped with 1,700 organs of locomotion, snaking through the waters, and as they went, throwing off every gleam in the solar spectrum. From the fish branch, there were manta rays, enormous cartilaginous fish 10 feet long and weighing 600 pounds, their pectoral fin triangular, their mid-back slightly arched, their eyes attached to the edges of the face at the front of the head. They floated like wreckage from a ship, sometimes fastening onto our windows like opaque shutters. There were American triggerfish, for which nature has ground only black and white pigments, feather-shaped gobies that were long and plump, with yellow fins and jutting jaws, 16 decimeter mackerel with short, sharp teeth covered with small scale and related to the albacore species. Next came swarms of red mullet, corseted in gold stripes from head to tail, their shining fins all a-quiver, genuine masterpieces of jewellery, formerly sacred to the goddess Diana, much in demand by rich Romans, and about which the old saying goes, "He who catches them doesn't eat them." Finally, adorned with emerald ribbons and dressed in velvet and silk, golden angelfish passed before our eyes like courtiers in the paintings of Veronese. Spurred gilt-heads stole by with their swift thoracic fins. Thread herring 15 inches long were wrapped in their phosphorescent glimmers. Grey mullet thrashed the sea with their big fleshy tails. Red salmon seemed to mow the waves with their slicing pectorals, and silver moonfish, worthy of their name, rose on the horizon of the waters like the whitish reflection of many moons. How many other marvellous new specimens I still could have observed if, little by little, the Nautilus hadn't settled to the lower strata. Its slanting fins drew it to depths of 2,000 and 3,500 meters. There, animal life was represented by nothing more than sea lilies, starfish, delightful crinoids with bell-shaped heads like little chalices on straight stems, top-shell snails, blood-red tooth shells, and fissurella snails, a large species of coastal mollusk. By April 20, we had risen to an average level of 1,500 meters. The nearest land was the island group of the Bahamas, scattered like a batch of cobblestones over the surface of the water. There, high underwater cliffs reared up, straight walls made of craggy chunks arranged like big stone foundations, among which there gaped black caves so deep our electric rays couldn't light them to the far ends. These rocks were hung with huge weeds, immense sea tangle, gigantic fucus, a genuine trellis of water plants fit for a world of giants. In discussing these colossal plants, Conseil, Ned, and I were naturally led into mentioning the sea's gigantic animals. The former were obviously meant to feed the latter. However, through the windows of our almost motionless Nautilus, I could see nothing among these long filaments other than the chief articulates of the division Brachyura, long-legged spider crabs, violet crabs, and sponge crabs unique to the waters of the Caribbean. It was about 11 o'clock when Ned Land drew my attention to a fearsome commotion out in this huge seaweed. "Well," I said, "these are real devilfish caverns, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those monsters hereabouts." "What?" Conseil put in. "Squid? Ordinary squid? From the class Cephalopoda?" "No," I said, "devilfish of large dimensions. But friend Land is no doubt mistaken, because I don't see a thing." "That's regrettable," Conseil answered. "I'd like to come face to face with one of those devilfish I've heard so much about, which can drag ships down into the depths. Those beasts go by the name of crake." "Fake, more like it," the Canadian replied sarcastically. "Krakens," Conseil shot back, finishing his word without wincing at his companion's witticism. "Nobody will ever make me believe," Ned Land said, "that such animals exist." "Why not?" Conseil replied. "We sincerely believed in Master's narwhale." "We were wrong, Conseil." "No doubt, but there are others with no doubts who believe to this day." "Probably, Conseil, but as for me, I'm bound and determined not to accept the existence of any such monster till I've dissected it with my own 2 hands." "Yet," Conseil asked me, "doesn't Master believe in gigantic devilfish?" "Yikes! Who in Hades ever believed in them?" the Canadian exclaimed. "Many people, Ned, my friend," I said. "No fishermen, scientists, maybe?" "Pardon me, Ned, fishermen and scientists." "Why, I to whom you speak," Conseil said with the world's straightest face, "I recall perfectly seeing a large boat dragged under the waves by the arms of a cephalopod." "You saw that?" the Canadian asked. "Yes, Ned." "With your own 2 eyes?" "With my own 2 eyes." Where, may I ask? In St. Malo, Conseil returned unflappably. In the harbour? Ned Land said sarcastically. No, in a church, Conseil replied. In a church? The Canadian exclaimed. Yes, Ned, my friend. It had a picture that portrayed the devilfish in question. Oh, good, Ned Land exclaimed with a burst of laughter. Mr. Conseil put one over on me. Actually, he's right, I said. I've heard about that picture, but the subject it portrays is taken from a legend, and you know how to rate legends in matters of natural history. Besides, when it's an issue of monsters, the human imagination always tends to run wild. People not only claimed these devilfish could drag ships under, but a certain Olaus Magnus tells of a cephalopod a mile long that looked more like an island than an animal. There's also the story of how the Bishop of Trondheim set up an altar one day on an immense rock. After he finished saying Mass, this rock started moving and went back into the sea. The rock was a devilfish. And that's everything we know? The Canadian asked. No, I replied. Another bishop, Pontoppidan of Bergen, also tells of a devilfish, so large a whole cavalry regiment could manoeuvre on it. They sure did go on, those old-time bishops, Ned Land said. Finally, the naturalists of antiquity mentioned some monsters with mouths as big as a gulf, which were too huge to get through the Straits of Gibraltar. Good work, men, the Canadian put in. But in all these stories, is there any truth? Conseil asked. None at all, my friends, at least in those that go beyond the bounds of credibility and fly off into fable or legend. Yet, for the imaginings of these storytellers, there had to be, if not a cause, at least an excuse. It can't be denied that some species of squid and other devilfish are quite large, though still smaller than cetaceans. Aristotle put the dimensions of one squid at 5 cubits, or 3.1 meters. Our fishermen frequently see specimens over 1.8 meters long. The museums in Trieste and Montpellier have preserved some devilfish carcasses measuring 2 meters. Besides, according to the calculations of naturalists, one of these animals, only 6 feet long, would have tentacles as long as 27, which is enough to make a fearsome monster. Does anybody fish for them nowadays? The Canadian asked. If they don't fish for them, sailors at least sight them. A friend of mine, Captain Paul Boss of Le Havre, has often sworn to me that he encountered one of these monsters of colossal size in the seas of the East Indies. But the most astonishing event, which proves that these gigantic animals undeniably exist, took place a few years ago in 1861. What event was that? Ned Land asked. Just this. In 1861, to the northeast of Tenerife, and fairly near the latitude where we are right now, the crew of the gunboat Alecto spotted a monstrous squid swimming in their waters. Commander Bouger approached the animal and attacked it with blows from harpoons and blasts from rifles, but without much success, because bullets and harpoons crossed its soft flesh as if it were semi-liquid jelly. After several fruitless attempts, the crew managed to slip a noose around the mollusk's body. The noose slid as far as the caudal fins and came to a halt. Then they tried to haul the monster on board, but its weight was so considerable that when they tugged on the rope, the animal parted company with its tail, and deprived of this adornment, it disappeared beneath the waters. Finally, an actual event, Ned Land said. An indisputable event, my gallant Ned. Accordingly, people have proposed naming this devil's fish Bouger's squid. And how long was it? The Canadian asked. Didn't it measure about 6 meters? Said Conseil, who was stationed at the window and examining anew the crevices in the cliff. Precisely, I replied. Wasn't its head, Conseil went on, crowned by 8 tentacles that quivered in the water like a nest of snakes? Precisely. Weren't its eyes prominently placed and considerably enlarged? Yes, Consul. And wasn't its mouth a real parrot's beak, but of fearsome size? Correct, Consul. Well, with all due respect to Master, Consul replied serenely, if this isn't Bouger's squid, it's at least one of his close relatives. I stared at Consul. Ned Land rushed to the window. What an awful animal, he exclaimed. I stared in my turn, and couldn't keep back a movement of revulsion. Before my eyes there quivered a horrible monster, worthy of a place amongst the most far-fetched teratological legends. It was a squid of colossal dimensions, fully 8 meters long. It was travelling backward with tremendous speed in the same direction as the Nautilus. It gazed with enormous staring eyes that were tinted sea green. Its 8 arms, or more accurately feet, were rooted in its head, which has earned these animals the name cephalopod. Its arms stretched a distance twice the length of its body, and were writhing like the serpentine hair of the Furies. You could plainly see its 250 suckers arranged over the inner sides of its tentacles and shaped like semi-ferric capsules. Sometimes these suckers fastened onto the lounge window by creating vacuums against it. The monster's mouth, a beak made of horn and shaped like that of a parrot, opened and closed vertically. Its tongue, also of horn substance and armed with several rows of sharp teeth, would flicker out from between these genuine shears. What a freak of nature! A bird's beak on a mollusk. Its body was spindle-shaped and swollen in the middle, a fleshy mass that must have weighed 20,000 to 25,000 kilograms. Its unstable colour would change with tremendous speed as the animal grew irritated, passing successively from bluish grey to reddish brown. What was irritating this mollusk? No doubt the presence of the Nautilus, even more fearsome than itself, and which it couldn't grip with its mandibles or the suckers on its arms. And yet what monsters these devilfish are! What vitality our Creator has given them! What vigour in their movements, thanks to their owning a triple heart! Sheer chance had placed us in the presence of this squid, and I didn't want to lose this opportunity to meticulously study such a cephalopod specimen. I overcame the horror that its appearance inspired in me, picked up a pencil, and began to sketch it. Perhaps this is the same as the Electos, Conseil said. Can't be, the Canadian replied, because this one's complete, while the other lost its tail. That doesn't necessarily follow, I said. The arms and tails of these animals grow back through regeneration, and in 7 years the tail on Bouger's squid has surely had time to sprout again. Anyhow, Ned shot back, if it isn't this fellow, maybe it's one of those. Indeed, other devilfish had appeared at our starboard window. I counted 7 of them. They provided the Nautilus with an escort, and I could hear their beaks gnashing on the sheet iron hull. We couldn't have asked for a more devoted following. I continued sketching. These monsters kept pace in our waters with such precision, they seemed to be standing still, and I could have traced their outlines in miniature on the window. But we were moving at a moderate speed. All at once the Nautilus stopped. A jolt made it tremble through its entire framework. Did we strike bottom? I asked. In any event, we're already clear, the Canadian replied, because we're afloat. The Nautilus was certainly afloat, but it was no longer in motion. The blades of its propeller weren't churning the waters. A minute passed. Followed by his chief officer, Captain Nemo entered the lounge. I hadn't seen him for a good while. He looked gloomy to me. Without speaking to us, without even seeing us perhaps, he went to the panel, stared at the devilfish, and said a few words to his chief officer. The latter went out. Soon the panels closed, the ceiling lit up. I went over to the captain. An unusual assortment of devilfish, I told him, as carefree as a collector in front of an aquarium. Correct, Mr. Naturalist, he answered me, and we're going to fight them at close quarters. I gaped at the captain. I thought my hearing had gone bad. At close quarters, I repeated. Yes, sir, our propeller is jammed. I think the horn-covered mandibles of one of these squid are entangled in the blades. That's why we aren't moving. And what are you going to do? Rise to the surface and slaughter the vermin. A difficult undertaking. Correct. Our electric bullets are ineffective against such soft flesh, where they don't meet enough resistance to go off. But we'll attack the beast with axes. And harpoons, sir, the Canadian said, if you don't turn down my help. I accept it, Mr. Land. We'll go with you, I said, and we followed Captain Nemo heading to the central companionway. There, some 10 men were standing by for the assault, armed with boarding axes. Conseil and I picked up 2 more axes. Ned Land seized a harpoon. By then, the Nautilus had returned to the surface of the waves. Stationed on the top steps, one of the seamen undid the bolts of the hatch. But he had scarcely unscrewed the nuts when the hatch flew up with tremendous violence, obviously pulled open by the suckers on a devilfish's arm. Instantly, one of those long arms glided like a snake into the opening, and 20 others were quivering above. With a sweep of the axe, Captain Nemo chopped off this fearsome tentacle, which slid writhing down the steps. Just as we were crowding each other to reach the platform, 2 more arms lashed the air, swooped on the seaman stationed in front of him, Captain Nemo, and carried the fellow away with irresistible violence. Captain Nemo gave a shout and leaped outside. We rushed after him. What a scene! Seized by the tentacle and glued to its suckers, the unfortunate man was swinging in the air at the mercy of this enormous appendage. He gasped, he choked, he yelled, "Help! Help!" These words, pronounced in French, left me deeply stunned. So, I had a fellow countryman on board, perhaps several. I'll hear this harrowing plea for the rest of my life. The poor fellow was done for. Who could tear him from such a powerful grip? Even so, Captain Nemo rushed at the devilfish, and with a sweep of the axe, hewed one more of its arms. His chief officer struggled furiously with the other monsters crawling up the Nautilus's sides. The crew battled with flailing axes. The Canadian, Conseil and I sank our weapons into these fleshy masses. An intense, musky odour filled the air. It was horrible. For an instant, I thought the poor man entwined by the devilfish might be torn loose from its powerful suction. 7 arms out of 8 had been chopped off. Brandishing its victim like a feather, one lone tentacle was writhing in the air. But just as Captain Nemo and his chief officer rushed at it, the animal shot off a spout of blackish liquid, secreted by a pouch located in its abdomen. It blinded us. When this cloud had dispersed, the squid was gone, and so was my poor fellow countryman. What rage then drove us against these monsters! We lost all self-control. 10 or 12 devilfish had overrun the Nautilus's platform and sides. We piled helter-skelter into the thick of those sawed-off snakes, which darted over the platform amid waves of blood and sepia ink. It seemed as if these vicious tentacles grew back like the many heads of Hydra. At every thrust, Ned Land's harpoon would plunge into a squid's sea-green eye and burst it. But my daring companion was suddenly toppled by the tentacles of a monster he could not avoid. Oh, my heart nearly exploded with excitement and horror. The squid's fearsome beak was wide open over Ned Land. The poor man was about to be cut in half. I ran to his rescue, but Captain Nemo got there first. His axe disappeared between the 2 enormous mandibles, and the Canadian, miraculously saved, stood and plunged his harpoon all the way into the devilfish's triple heart. Tit for tat, Captain Nemo told the Canadian. I owed it to myself. Ned bowed without answering him. This struggle had lasted a quarter of an hour. Defeated, mutilated, battered to death, the monsters finally yielded to us and disappeared beneath the waves. Red with blood, motionless by the beacon, Captain Nemo stared at the sea that had swallowed one of his companions, and large tears streamed from his eyes. End of chapter 18.